Thank you and good morning.
Good morning.
Well, I'm not quite sure where to start. There's a lot going on in my life. In fact, I'm supposed to go to a deposition this morning to hear from our ambassador to the European Union, who was involved in asking the Ukrainian president to cooperate with getting political dirt on a prospective political opponent of the president. So these are serious times, and a lot going on. Teresa mentioned I'm also senior in foreign affairs. I co-chair the Turkey caucus, among other caucuses. What happened yesterday in the pullout of U.S. troops as a buffer between Turkey and the Kurds is potentially tragic. The Kurds have fought with the United States, the only group that fought with us and successfully defeated ISIS on the ground in Syria, destroying the so-called caliphate and winning back territory with our cooperation. But they were the only allies we had, and they fought quite bravely. They lost thousands of their fighters in that effort against terrorism. And for us to decide that we're going to pull out and allow the Turks, who see the Kurds as all terrorists, because there is a Kurdish independence movement, is going to put those Kurds at risk. And you've seen a lot of criticism, by the way, the loudest coming from Republicans, who are very concerned about the import of this decision. So on both fronts, we're busy. But let me try to talk about other things, and we can talk about all that stuff too if you want. One of the important things about our region is this partnership between the federal government and the private sector. That is what, in many ways, created the economy of much of Northern Virginia. How many of you are federal contractors? Unusual. If I asked that same question in the other county, almost every hand would go up, because it's a source of huge employment. I probably represent the third or fourth largest number of federal employees in the United States of any congressional district, but I bet you for every federal employee I've got 2 or 3 federal contract employees. And so contracting with the federal government, huge source of employment, and growing in terms of outsourcing for government goods and services. And increasingly, in our district and in Northern Virginia generally, we're providing a lot of intellectual heft for the federal government. So, you look at, if you look at the development of the internet, a lot of it took place here in Northern Virginia, and the maintenance of what was called DARPANet at the time was done by Northern Virginia companies. Next gen, work for the FAA done here. Drone technology research, unmanned vehicles of all kinds, just all kinds of robotics. Cybersecurity, we are a key place for doing all of that, and that's going to generate new technologies and new jobs for our region, especially. So, prospects are very bright for economic development here. But we have to make the necessary investments. Now, when I was on the board of that other place, I made as my number one goal getting the Silver Line from East Falls Church to Dulles Airport as my number one priority. Now, that was in 1995. In 1995, nobody was talking about rail to Dulles. It had died. In fact, when I brought it up saying, I'm gonna actually run on that, that's gonna be my #1 priority, people thought, are you crazy? And we tried that, done it, never gonna happen. It's too complicated, you gotta put together a tax district, the feds won't fund it, the state won't even pay attention. You know, focus on other things. And what I learned from that experience was nothing happens if you don't start imagining it. And here in Prince William, we got to start imagining alternatives to the automobile. And we better do it quickly because you know, I was looking at the, oh my God, congestion going the other way coming out this morning. And they're all going to jobs outside of Prince William County. And there's a reason for that, because we don't have transit. When we were looking at sites for the new FBI headquarters, Prince William had a site near Quantico. It was thrown out immediately. The reason? No proximity to transit. That was the federal government, a major employer. If you talk to millennials, you know, they want to use transit. They don't want to drive. My daughter's a classic example. She left her car at home, doesn't even start anymore. And she moved downtown, and everything is transit to work and Uber, you know, at night. And they want to be near, you know, or be able to get to work through methods other than the automobile. And so, you know, Prince William is going to grow. Our congestion will only get worse. So we need to get smart about, well, okay, what investments should we be looking at? And what I've been arguing since I became congressman here is at least how about we look at the the feasibility. We don't have to do it. We can decide, even if it's feasible, we don't want to do it. We don't want to pay for it. We don't want the disruption. We don't want the commitment. But if we don't at least imagine it, I assure you, it will never happen. Transit is hard enough. I have the scars all over my body in terms of the ups and downs of the Silver Line. It's a complicated process because the federal government makes it complicated, and financing it is not easy. But we've got to have leadership at the county level here that has that vision and is going to engage state and federal officials to begin that conversation. There are corridors in Prince William that lend themselves to transit. And I guarantee you, when you do polling in Prince William, they want these transit investments. They want us to be exploring them. I just think the longer we ignore that, you know, the more expensive and the more difficult it will become. Transit never gets cheaper. You know, yesterday was the most affordable, today is sort of affordable, and tomorrow becomes more difficult. So the sooner we can sort of have the opportunity for Prince William to take this bull by the horns and show some vision and leadership, I think it's just necessary for a future and necessary for businesses. You know, look at the Silver Line. If you look at what is happening because of the Silver Line in the Dulles Corridor, it is exploding with new growth, and it's the right kind of growth. It's mixed-use development. I'll give you a little story, but Tyson's Corner is as big as my hometown of Boston. Only 17,000 people live in Tyson's Corner, but 150,000 people commute there at precisely the same time every morning, and 150,000 people leave there at precisely the same time every night. And you can actually see it if you're in a window in an office looking down at those traffic patterns. You can actually see it's all combined in peak hour and right after peak hour. Easy. Silver Line is transforming that. All of a sudden, we're going to have mini, almost cities all over Tyson's that are going to have all kinds of amenities, including environmental amenities we don't have now. grid of streets we don't have now, and we're going to go from 17,000 people living there to 100,000 people living there. And the good news about that is they're going to use Metro to work, right? I mean, why would you pay a premium for an apartment next to a Metro station so you can go in your car and drive?
Mm-hmm.
You wouldn't, right? And you're going to leave the car in the garage or not have one at all, and you're going to use Metro. But also employment centers start clustering because employers realize their millennial employees want to use Metro, so they're going to try to find a site closer to those transit nodes up and down the corridor. You see it, you can go to Tyson's, you see the transformation before your eyes. And likewise, Reston and Herndon and Route 28 and ultimately Loudon will benefit from this because Loudon decided, even with a conservative Republican majority on their board at the time, they understood the economic, that if they didn't get in the game, they would lose. And they're already talking about, even though they're only going to have, the station at Dulles and one beyond. So it's not like a huge intrusion of transit into Loudon, but it's enough of one to actually start economic planning around that feature. And so, we need to be talking about that in Prince William in a creative way. The business community needs to get involved because you can't do it without the business community. When we did the Silver Line, we had to have a special tax district to fund it, and that meant that 51% of the landowners in the corridor had to say, "Please tax me extra." That's the law in Virginia. We couldn't impose it, and that was a devil of a time. But you know what? They saw what advantages would come from Metro being extended to the Dulles corridor. Now, there's a reason there are 650,000 jobs in that other county. 650,000 jobs. Only the Federal Triangle has more jobs in the region, and it's growing. In fact, if you add full-time and part-time, that other place is number one in the region. And that corridor is beginning to show what it can do. I mean, the Dulles corridor is going to be the economic juggernaut of the entire region. It wouldn't have happened without the key investment of the Silver Line. Just would not have happened. Land values, the willingness to invest and develop and redevelop, people wanting to live there, all that good stuff. So I want to see Prince William, and I want to work with the incoming leadership to have a different vision for us that we offer to people. They can decide if they want to do it. But not having that vision, doing nothing, we're going to get more of the same. Because we're going to grow by another 50 or 60,000 people, and a lot of people are coming through Prince William to get to those jobs somewhere else. And wouldn't it be nice if we had more Iron Mountains and more Microns that kept people here? And anyway, that's a message. Government shutdown. Last year the government shut down for 35 days. It was unprecedented. It had never happened before, and it had, if there's a region in the United States disproportionately affected by government shutdown, guess who? It's us. And it's because of that partnership that I talked about earlier. So many jobs, so many businesses, heavily reliant on that federal partnership and the flow of federal revenue. It's disheartening for a lot of companies because a lot of companies embed in federal agencies. So they not only provide services that get purchased, they provide personnel who work in the federal agency side by side with the federal employees. You wouldn't know who's who. When we have a federal government shutdown, that federal employee is guaranteed to be made whole once it's over. But the federal contract employee is entirely at the mercy of his or her company in terms of what they work out, because they're not getting paid and they may not get paid. And if you're a small vendor, this may put you out of business. 35-day shutdown can put you out of business because maybe you're a 5 or 10 person firm providing a specific service. I had a constituent, still do, who ran a coffee shop at a federal office building downtown. He hired ex-convicts who were getting rehabilitated. He had a real, by the way, a conservative Republican, but he wanted to give people a second chance. And he said, all but one were incredible employees, really motivated, always reliable. And he ran the coffee shop and the sandwich shop. So morning business, lunch business, right? It wasn't open for dinner. But it's a low margin kind of thing. It was in the federal headquarters building downtown. I won't name the federal headquarters, GSA. But when the federal government shut down for 35 days, he couldn't pay his rent. Business completely collapsed because people weren't coming to work. And he had to lay off all of his employees. And he's not sure he can survive, even now, because the backlog of debt and what he owed, because his rent kept on going. They didn't cut him slack for the rent, even though the federal government is his landlord. And so there were a lot of stories like that that didn't get the attention, in the press. But in our district, we had a lot of small businesses that were affected very adversely by that shutdown. So we want to avoid shutdowns, right? And so we got the majority in January, and we pledged we were going to try to move as quickly as we could on getting appropriations bills passed. And the House has passed 10 of the 12 appropriations bills. The other two are ready to go, but there are controversies unrelated to the normal funding that have held up two of those bills. They're ready to go, but the Senate has not passed a single appropriation bill. And oh, by the way, sometimes we get asked, impeachment's gonna just, that's all the focus, and we're not gonna. We've passed over 100 bills unrelated to impeachment, on immigration, on health care, on the economy, on jobs, on transportation, on voting rights, on women's reproductive rights, on violence against women, all kinds of bills that have been passed in this Congress. And the Senate, of course, has become this sort of slow meat grinder to not act on a lot of that. Even after massacres, more massacres, including one right here in Virginia again this year, we thought we had agreement, even with the president, on trying to have background checks, legislation that would kind of toughen that up and make it more enforceable. By the way, that was a position favored by the NRA not that long ago. A number of Republicans came out in favor of it, but we couldn't get any action on the Senate. We passed it in the House, crickets in the Senate. Sam Rayburn, the late Speaker of the House, used to say, as a Democratic speaker, he said, the Republicans are the opposition, but the Senate is the enemy. And sometimes it feels that way in terms of the legislative process, so we'll see what happens. But our goal is obviously not to have another shutdown. We're operating now on a continuing resolution that will expire later this fall after our election here in Virginia, and one always worries, even if no one goes into the process intending for a shutdown, it can happen. And we really, after the experience we had of the 35-day shutdown, and what I worry about is, frankly, there were almost no political consequences for that. That's what's remarkable about it. Who paid a price for shutting down because if someone had paid a price, politicians would look at that going, well, we don't want to do that anymore. My God, look at what happened to him. But nobody paid a price for it. And that worries me a lot. So the longest shutdown ever, and nobody had anything to worry about. People affected paid a price, but politically no one paid a price. And that's something to watch. So we will see. what else would you like me to talk about before we open it up? You want, well, all right. Trade. How about trade? I am a free trader. I was one of only 28 Democrats to support the Trade Promotion Authority that was necessary to support the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a big free trade agreement for the Asia-Pacific region, which we wrote, the United States wrote. I've supported, free trade agreements with Panama and Brazil, South Korea, Japan, Israel, and to me, the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a very important step forward. It had protections on labor and the environment and human rights, but it also united a number of countries to counter China in an economic competitive way. And they were really excited about wanting to do that, because if you're Vietnam, where do you turn? China's your big neighbor, you fought a war against them. Guess who they turned to? The United States. And they were eager to be part of what's called TPP. I paid a price as a Democrat for supporting TPP. Organized labor decided to sit out my race that year, and for the first time in my career, not endorse me. I've never made a secret of my free trade position since the day I ran for this job, but they decided to make examples out of Democrats and supported the TPP. I believe President Trump made a tragic error and really hurt America's interests by walking away from our own treaty, TPP, because now those countries have no place to turn but China. And the last thing in the world we want to be doing, it seems to me, is retreating from the Asia-Pacific region. That's the fastest growing region in the world. Economically, that's where the future is. And we are a Pacific nation. Our west coast looks east. And we need to play. And we need to be competitive. And we can be. Why would we cede this unilaterally to our competitor? And the Chinese are still drinking, champagne in Beijing over this decision. It's not in our economic interest. My hope is that when this period ends, we will revisit this issue and rejoin our own treaty and try to salvage what we can to plant, our stake in the region and be competitive with the Chinese. And the Chinese are, doing a lot of things we're not doing. They're making incredible investments domestically. I talked about the Silver Line earlier. The first time the idea of maybe, spitballing here, maybe we should have a rail link between the nation's premier international airport, so designated, Dulles, and the nation's capital. Just a thought, because they seem to have it in every other industrialized capital in the world. That was 1962. We signed the full funding grant agreement with the federal government to proceed in 2009. 47 years later. I don't think the Chinese take 4.7 years to build high-speed rail, new metro systems, new bridges, new ports, new airports. I was there 3 years ago, I think. I couldn't believe what I saw. I was dazzled by the investments they're making in infrastructure that take us forever. Now their public process isn't everything we'd like it to be, but maybe we get a little too carried away sometimes with ours. Certainly the approval process, because it impedes our ability to make decisions sometimes, and to make these infrastructure investments. We need trade as a country. We need open trading systems. We need to enforce the rules of the road in trade. And the one thing I give the Trump administration credit for is they're willing to call out the strikes with respect to Chinese behavior in trade and intellectual property in a way that both Republican and Democratic presidents before had been shy, because China's so big and, oh my God, we need them and so forth. Well, their predatory behavior has to be called out. And they're no longer a developing country. They are a major economic rival. Their GDP is probably going to pass ours in the next couple of years, 2 or 3 years. They're going to be #1 in the world. Think about that. I'm old enough to remember a famine in China. It's a very rapid development, but we should have no illusions about who is our prime economic competitor as we move forward in the future. And we need to make sure we've got the tools to compete. One of them is free trade. And trade alliances with countries that want to work with us. And so we got to be careful that, we're smart and we don't do stupid things like walking away from our own trade agreement just because somebody else negotiated it. We have, pending before us, I would say amendments, modifications to NAFTA, the North America Free Trade Agreement. You may recall when President Trump became president, he threatened both Mexico and Canada, our #1 and #2 trading partners in the world, ripping up NAFTA and just, nullifying it because he thought we were getting a raw deal. And so negotiations began, and essentially what they've produced are some modifications to the underlying North American Free Trade Agreement, and I don't know, it's not a major rewrite at all. He says it is. It isn't. So there are some dairy provisions that help our dairy farmers. U.S. content is maybe the biggest thing affected, so that it increases the amount of domestic content required for especially automobiles, things like that. And there's some pharmaceutical provisions, and that's sort of it. And they want to get a vote. They need Democrats to vote for it, right, to agree to it. And given how Democrats did not vote for TPP under President Obama, how likely are they to vote for a trade agreement under President Trump? But I will say that I think Ambassador Lighthizer, who serves their point person on trade, has done a good job in reaching out. It's the only example I can point to where they have genuinely made an effort to reach out to both sides of the aisle. And we've had them come before one of the groups I belong to and talk about this. And I would say we're probably on a path to agreeing to it. My concern is that impeachment may make that harder. If you're a Democrat getting ready to vote to impeach the president, how readily do you want to turn around the next day and vote to give him, his free trade agreement and make that a priority in your life? It's not going to be a priority for Democrats. It's going to be something they might get around to doing, but not in an enthusiastic way. So I would say that what looked to be on track to pass this year, I think he calls it the United States Mexico Canada agreement or something, USMCA. It really is a series of amendments to NAFTA, and if they come up, I'll certainly support them, but I don't know that I'll make it a priority in my life, given everything else we're doing. And I do think that the fate of this, the closer we get to the presidential year, 2020, this fades as a priority for a lot of my colleagues. So that's one to watch. And finally, let me just end on, where are we in impeachment? I personally believe, I waited until Robert Mueller testified. I read the Mueller report carefully. I was deeply disturbed by what I read. If you frame the issue as a Democrat politically, at least until the last 2 weeks, you did not support impeachment because politically it looked too risky. And we don't want to do things that make it harder to try to prevail in next year's elections. I did not frame it that way. I took an oath. I take that oath every 2 years, that the voters have me, to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. I didn't take an oath to protect and defend the political prospects of my party. I didn't take an oath to listen to where popular opinion is and follow that. I took an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. And when I see somebody violating the Constitution of the United States, abusing his office, violating the law, I feel I have a duty to act on that, however unpopular or popular it may be. And that's how I framed the issue, and that's why I came out in favor of 4 categories of potentially articles of impeachment in early August, after Robert Mueller had testified. That was before Ukraine. Up to Ukraine, about 138 Democrats and 1 independent who had been a Republican came out in favor of impeachment. After Ukraine revelations, 87 more Democrats joined in calling for impeachment. Why? Well, we have prima facie evidence in front of us that the president got on the phone. The president inexplicably suspended $400 million worth of military aid to Ukraine. Why is that important? Because there are Russian troops in the eastern part of their country fighting them as we speak. And as you may recall, Russia illegally occupied and annexed Crimea, part of sovereign Ukrainian territory. And because they did that, they were kicked out of the G7, and sanctions were imposed on the Russians by the Europeans and by us because of what they did. Nonetheless, fighting still goes on in the eastern part of Ukraine. And so the Ukrainians decided to elect a new president, and I was there 2 weeks before the election, they decided they were so sick of corrupt politicians in their system. Unlike here, they have corrupt politicians. They decided to throw everybody out. And there was a guy named Zelensky who was a popular TV star. And he played an ordinary Ukrainian who kind of suddenly stumbled into the presidency of Ukraine. As this man on the street who's just dishonest and non-political. And so everyone said, well, that's a pretty good idea. And they elected him as president. No one knows, what's his foreign policy, what are his politics, does he like Russia, does he like America, will he cooperate with us, will he cooperate with them, is he pro-European, where's he want to take the country, no one knew. And so he's untested. He doesn't know anything about diplomacy or talking to foreign leaders on the phone. So you can imagine, and of course, who's the one place, the one country he's got to have on his side if he's going to fight Vladimir Putin and the Russians and get them out of his country? Us. So what happens? Inexplicably in July, the United States announces it's suspending all military aid to Ukraine. And meanwhile, some of our diplomats are negotiating with the new president of the Ukraine for a special visit to the United States to meet with President Trump. But there are conditions. And it turns out the condition is, we want you to cooperate with Rudy Giuliani when he comes to visit you, who is seeking dirt on a particular American political figure of the opposition. Now, that is wrong. That is an abuse of office. It is also illegal. And I went to the deposition last week to hear the man who had been President Trump's special envoy to Ukraine, who resigned his job when this all came out, and came before Congress to testify. And he gave us a series of text messages and emails that he had kept between himself and other people in the State Department and with the Ukrainian government, explicitly confirming that this was understood as a condition. And it most certainly was a quid pro quo, and it's extortion. I think for a lot of Americans, and certainly for my colleagues in Congress, that is crossing a line we cannot allow. Because if we let this go, then somebody has to tell me what is the limit on a future president. I guess we can use all foreign relations to our own political benefit to keep ourselves in office and to, smite our political foes as we see fit, and to engage foreign powers in that effort. And we can't have that. So that's what's happening. There's a series of depositions. I belong on 2 of the 3 committees that are undertaking these depositions, one of which is this morning in about 25 minutes. And there'll be others as well. And we'll see where this goes. I would say to you candidly, I believe firmly the president will be impeached by the House, and I believe it probably will be this year, before Christmas. And then under the Constitution, the House has sole jurisdiction with respect to that. The Senate has sole jurisdiction to have a trial. And we've only had 2 in our history. So we have some protocols about how that happens. And, then it's a moment of truth for the United States Senate. And we'll see where this takes us. It's a very grave moment, not something I relish at all. And it's something I spent a long, long time thinking about, researching, and even praying about, frankly. I may not like a particular political figure in the White House, but impeaching that individual is a very different matter. And that's not about liking him or what political parties we belong to. It's about behavior and respect for the Constitution and separation of powers in this country. Our freedoms depend on insisting and enforcing that fundamental respect. And if we don't, then you have to ask yourself, what will be the behavioral norms in the future? What will be the limits on the president in the future? And our founders were extremely sensitive about limiting the power of the executive. They had George III in mind. That's why Article 1 of the Constitution is Article 1, about the legislative branch and its powers. It's not Article 16. It wasn't an afterthought. It was the first thought. Presidential powers are Article 2. And if you read the Federalist Papers, Madison certainly, one of the chief authors of both the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, he felt that actually the House, the people's body, was the preeminent part of the new government. So we have a very important role to play, and we will try to do it as judiciously and carefully as possible. Thank you. Let's open it up.
Thank you, Congressman Connolly. Do we have some questions? Yeah, please.
Thank you for
As
breakfast.
You're welcome. You're welcome. As much as I'd like to talk about 3 or 4 things that you've already discussed, I'm going to try to limit my question to an economic development one. I am familiar and have watched some of the stuff with the Silver Line and in Tyson's and what's going to happen in Reston and farther out. I would be curious how you contrast that with the Yellow Line and the Springfield station, and the further expansion to, what frankly is becoming a clean slate for development in North Woodbridge. It seems to me that in Springfield, the massive development didn't happen the same way. And how would you contrast those two?
Well, I think one of the things about the Silver Line is it's in a corridor. I mean, a real defined corridor. Roughly airport to East Falls Church. With some really important economic anchors already.
Mm-hmm.
We weren't starting de novo. So we had Tyson's, we had Reston, we had Herndon, we had Route 28, and then the airport. So, so very clear what you had to do. Very clear you could do it from an engineering point of view. Now, there was a big debate that got started under, not over, and we had a big engineering debate about that. And, if we had tried to do it all underground, it would have added probably a couple of $1 billion to the project. We didn't have that. And the federal government is very strict about the financial feasibility of these transit projects. They don't do the same thing with roads, but they do with transit. So we definitely would no longer have qualified, and we would have been kicked out of the approved projects and start all over again. That would have killed the project. So we had to fight that one, and we did. So I look at, I'll give you an example, but Fort Belvoir gives us the opportunity, when you look at Route 1, for a mini corridor. All right, so a lot of the people who come to Fort Belvoir are coming from here and south. And so it lends itself to a rationale for transit. We could move those people to this huge source of employment. Fort Belvoir now has more people working there than the Pentagon.
Wow.
Yeah. It's astounding. And if you think of the Pentagon, it's served by Metro, it's served by buses like you can't believe. Go look at the bus bays there. It's got a grid of highways that service it very well as well. I mean, it even has helicopters. So Fort Belvoir is served by 95. Yeah, and Route 1. That's right. That's it. We've got a little bus express program called Rex in that corridor, but that's an interim solution, right? And it doesn't really serve the people coming from here. So we have an opportunity to look at a corridor and use that anchor that's already there, Belvoir, to try to move people, and maybe in the process revitalize the corridor. So now the county has to do that. The county has to envision all of that. But that's how you do it. What are the logical corridors? Getting to Potomac Mills has been suggested as another logical corridor. And I think we've outlined 3 or 4 corridors we think in Prince William that might make sense, that you ought to look at. Maybe the county would look at others as well, which they should. But helping to imagine this, engaging the business community and local residents about, well, okay, how do we see this, and what might happen, and what do we want to happen? And then you can look at feasibility. Well, how would we pay for that? My hope is over time the federal government will make it easier. I mean, when you look at, I'll give you an example of how hard the federal government has made it now, and that's why local vision and action is so critical here. The original metro in Washington was 80% funded by the federal government, and in some cases 90%. Silver Line, the federal government originally capped its entire participation at $900 million, which would have been about 17% of the cost of the project. A complete reversal. And we were responsible for figuring out how we finance the rest of it. I'm thinking, well, this is the nation's capital, and I mean, Rome didn't have to do that, Tokyo didn't have to do that. London didn't have to do that. Paris, it was clearly a federal responsibility to connect the premier airport to the nation's capital. And so somehow here that's a local responsibility. So if we can free up not only more federal dollars, but make it easier for people to qualify for those dollars, that makes things a lot easier too, in terms of, okay, now we know what we got and all that. If you make it too difficult, people throw up their hands thinking, well, even if we could get consent for other financing, the feds make it so hard we may never get that, or not in our lifetime, or something like that. So, but we got to start, and there has to be strong will here if that's what we want. If that's what we want, I've always said, you know, we may look at the feasibility and decide it isn't feasible by our lights or not desirable for various reasons, and then we have taken our fate in our own hands and made a decision about it. But let's not do that by default. Let's do that in a thoughtful way that engages everybody, and we come to some kind of decision through that process.
Thank you.
David.
First of all, let me give you a plug. I've had the pleasure of working with a number of your former colleagues, Republican and Democrat, for decades, and it amazes me how much time you spend in Prince William. Probably equals all of the others combined, and we do appreciate that.
My wife thinks I have an apartment.
Well, we'll give you a letter, whatever you need. I too support Metro, and I think it's imperative that sooner or later, and hopefully sooner we do that. But in the interim, we've got the Virginia Railway Express.
That's right. That's right.
It took us years to get that, but on June, whatever that date was, of 1992, about a mile from here, we had the grand opening of the inauguration of the Virginia Railway Express. And Governor Wilder was the speaker and the governor at the time. And I recall as vividly as it was yesterday that I said in my remarks that I would hope that in the next couple of years we'd be able to make the VRE bi-directional, like the Long Island Railroad, so that our community could go up and down instead of just up in the morning and back at night. Here it is 27 years later, and it still is not bi-directional. I think until Metro does come here, that really is a sore spot on our economic development and livability in Prince William. So I would just urge you to whatever you can do, negotiate with the railroads, the Long Bridge, whatever it is, to try to finally get that expedited and get some service for Prince William County.
Well, you know, David, thank you so much for saying that. And at my level, I'm a partner. You know, I can help and I can try to grease wheels in the federal system, but I need to have a local partner. They've got to, you know, when we did the Silver Line, it was my county's leadership that was critical. And we enlisted the governor and the members of Congress, and, you know, but they weren't going to do anything. I mean, there's a limited amount of political capital you got and time you got, and you place it where it's going to make the most difference. And if I have an unwilling or indifferent partner in the local level, I move on to somebody who wants to work, you know. So we need to really have a serious conversation about transportation options, and I agree with your point. I mean, my view is move on all fronts. The key to managing congestion is not that we'll eliminate it. It is to provide commuters choices. So you have, you know, if I can give you 6 choices today and every day, you know, you can decide what's best for you that day. But right now we don't have choices here. We really are limited choices. So can we expand those choices? Can we make other investments? What are we willing to do? Sometimes, with respect to Metro, Prince William is a free rider. There are a lot of Prince Williamites who use Metro, but we're not a member of the compact, and, you know, it saved us money, but it also kept us out of the game. And we're gonna have, we've got some catch up to do. But VRE is absolutely something, it's successful. You're old enough, I'm old enough to remember when people made fun of it and called it a white elephant. Nobody would use it. What a waste. Well, I don't know, I think we're at 22,000 riders a day and we need more capacity. And if we could have more capacity, we could, I don't know what the limit is, we probably could get to 35,000, and that's great, but it doesn't, it siphons off some of that congestion, but, and it's a necessary choice we need to exploit and build on, but we also have to look at other choices as well. But as you said, while we're doing that. And it's a classic story, that was 27 years ago. I wonder what happened to that.
Yeah.
So we've got to have a mechanism for follow-up and sticking with it and building a team that will advocate for these, the choices we decide we want to make and the investments that are going to be required. If you're not willing to pay for the investments, I mean, the one thing I learned in 14 years in local government, and infrastructure is not financed by fairy dust. There are, at the end of the day, someone's got to pay for it. And new infrastructure requires new revenue. There's just no getting around it. We're trying to face that at the federal level. We haven't raised the gas tax. We haven't even indexed it to inflation, so we haven't touched it since 1995. Well, the buying power has decreased. As vehicles get more efficient, that source of revenue starts to decline, and so it's less reliable. And meanwhile, our infrastructure deteriorates all over the United States. And so we're facing, in some ways, the same kinds of dilemmas. And there are not easy choices, but you got to pay for it. And I think in infrastructure, when people can see what something pays for, it's easier to say, all right, that one I'll pay for. It can't be abstract. And that's why I really believe in helping people visualize. Like on the Silver Line, when we started showing renditions of what the stations would look like, so that you could now help imagine what a neighborhood or an apartment building or whatever might look like, in contrast to what was on the ground, people got excited, and the support kind of jumped up. So I'm hopeful, but I'm impatient about, we need leadership in this county that's gonna get serious about this. And we haven't had it. Not you, but I'm talking about more local. Andrea, speaking of new leadership. Happy birthday.
Absolutely, Congressman. Thank you so much. I agree with David. Your partnership with this county is impeccable, and we need you. I will be the next leadership to partner with you and to partner to make sure that it is holistically growing. I'm a former resident of that other place that you talked about. When I saw it growing and your vision for the Silver Line, and to see it come to fruition, that tells me that there is hope for Prince William County. And so there, for me, as a future leader, there's an intangible that we could talk about the infrastructure, we can talk about the funding, but there's an intangible with the community that we have to build as well in support of to move forward. And so my question to you is, from your leadership in that other place, what are the intangibles that the local leaders need to do to build that trust and to build, that let's lock arms and move forward?
So lots of engagement mechanisms, right? So task forces and town hall meetings and using forums like this to make this the topic of at least some of the conversation. I think talking about benefits, this is not like, when you make this kind of investment, it has a huge return on it. Let's take the Silver Line. Okay, the Silver Line will have cost, I don't know, probably $5.6 billion. So what's the return on that? Well, it's going to attract, and already is, billions, many multiples of that in new development. It's going to generate, we think, $1 billion in tax revenue for the county. $1 billion. And you go to schools and say, what do you think you could do with that? Or libraries, or parks, or, and this is all money being generated that is not being required of the homeowner on the property tax. So I can bring you relief because of this huge new base we're building, much of it commercial. So we're diversifying our tax base, less reliant on the homeowner, and meanwhile, it's a better place to live, it's a more interesting and vibrant place, it's economically successful, and it's giving us this return on this investment we made that allows us to reinvest in the things that improve our quality of life. Education, public, open space and environment, law enforcement, so forth, to keep us crime rate low and parks clean and open and children healthy and getting educated. I mean, not a bad deal. Wasn't that a worthwhile investment? And not everyone thinks it is. Some people want to pay for nothing and don't want anything to change. But the fact is, things do change if you don't change too, right? Everything we experience will get worse congestion-wise. That I guarantee you that's going to happen. You'll see it deteriorate. We'll make improvements, but most of those improvements are designed to simply absorb the new capacity. I tremble to think what it will look like 20 years from now. What will our commutes be? I can tell you, representing the two counties, when I do a telephone town hall meeting, I've done about almost 30 now, since I've been in Congress, and they're great mechanisms because people don't have to come out, they can be in the PJs and get on the phone. We reach 10 to 20,000 constituents at a time with each of these telephone town hall meetings. But I have to wait till 8 o'clock to do it because of Prince William.
Yeah.
People aren't home. If I could do it at 7 if I only wanted to reach people in that other county. But I represent both, so we have to wait for 8 o'clock. Now, that extra hour, in a sense, of commuting tells you a lot about culture. It affects civic life. In that other county, if you're getting home 6:30, 7 o'clock, you can have dinner, interact with the kids, and go out to your civic association meeting, or your league meeting, or whatever it is. Here, if I'm getting home at 8 and I haven't eaten yet, and I haven't even seen my spouse or my kids, and I'm not so sure I'm that eager to want to go out that door and go to a meeting. A little harder. Quality of life is affected, and it affects everything. And I see it representing both counties. So, and I'm very sensitive to that because it's a huge, burden on a lot of people. One of the worst commutes in America, time-wise, was from Prince William, Bristol, to downtown. And it was one summer, I decided I was going to do, I was going to spend the whole month of August in different commuting patterns with constituents to experience what, or highlight it. And we knew somebody in Bristol, and I said, I'd like to commute with you, you pick a day. And so we're in the car, and he said, really? This is the worst commute in America, in an urban boundary? And I said, yeah, you're number one. And he said, oh, I can't believe that. I said, well, really? Tell me about your commute. He said, well, I get up at 4. And I try to get in the road by, 5:30. I get downtown, I go to the gym because my office isn't open yet. And, you know, and shower and have a little breakfast and then get to the office. I try to stay late so I beat the evening rush hour. So, you know, it's 7:30ish when I finally get in the road. You know, I'm home by 8:30. And I'm thinking, you don't think you have the longest commute in America? You know, you just described a horror show every day. I commuted with one guy on slugging. I went to slugging with him, and he was still recovering from heart attacks. And his doctor had said the stress of the commute, and so by slugging, he had actually improved his health because he wasn't so. But I mean, you know, the impact of this congestion dominates our lives. You know, we're one of the few places in America where, you know, we don't talk about how many miles is it. Everything we do, we describe in time.
How long does it take?
Yeah, well, and we even, when someone says, well, how far away is it? We still answer in time. It's about 45 minutes. Mileage doesn't, you know, I have colleagues that would be such an alien concept, right? You know, if they're in Montana, they're describing distance. 127 miles, but not here because the commute is so unpredictable, and if something goes wrong, oh my God, that time frame, you know, changes. So it's a very impactful thing on everything we do, and we have to try to make it better.
In Montana, that's a 75-minute drive, I think.
Yeah, yeah, they probably don't have speed limits. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Will Keith, AARP, and some of your ardent supporters here. And I've been asked to ask you, will you support H.R. 3, that's Nancy Pelosi's health care bill,
Yes.
when it comes to the floor?
Yeah, HR 3 is about drug pricing.
Yes, you are.
Yes, I'm a strong supporter. I mean, look, I'm all for free markets, and I'm all for private companies. I come from the private sector, so I mean, I worked for two big companies before I got to Congress, and I'm a strong pro-business Democrat. But some of the practices of some of the pharmaceutical companies are life-threatening, and I'll give you an example: insulin. Now, if the argument is we have to charge a very high price to recover the R&D costs we put into developing this drug, all right, that's a fair argument if it's a brand new drug. Insulin is over 100 years old. There's nothing new about insulin, but it's a life-saving and necessary drug for people who are diabetics. And to jack up the price, you know, 300 or 400% because a company took over another company and it can, is really, I think, predatory behavior that puts lives in jeopardy. And all of a sudden people are cutting back on how much they use, you know, skipping sometimes. And that, if you're a diabetic, you know, if you're not careful about your blood sugar and managing it, you risk kidney failure, blindness, neuropathy, all kinds of horrible things. You know, a lot of Americans are diabetic. It's epidemic in America. It's not an uncommon or rare disease. And so, you ask yourself, well, what is the responsibility of government to protect Americans suffering from that condition with respect to the price of their drug that they need daily? And we've had other examples. EpiPen, same thing. Well, EpiPen's not, the only new thing about the company jacking up the price, I think they jacked it up 750%, was packaging. I mean, I don't think they did a thing, not even in terms of how they deliver the drug. It was just somebody who took over a company and decided to maximize profit. Well, there are a lot of people who need EpiPens who are, anaphylatic, right? If a bee stings them, it's life-threatening for them. Or certain kinds of things they're exposed to, food allergies, that can be life-threatening because the respiratory system shuts down. That EpiPen is essential to shocking everything back into functioning. Schools know this, because, if a kid has that condition, the nurse often, has that EpiPen for that kid, knowing if they have an asthma attack or whatever it may be, that's the instant thing to do before you call 911, to save the life. I'm all for pharmaceutical companies having a realistic profit, but I'm also about protecting consumers from confiscatory, predatory practices that are pure greed. There has to be a balance. We have an obligation, it seems to me, to have a free market, but make sure it serves the needs of the people we serve. So yeah, I will support HR 3 for those reasons.
Final question. Anybody?
How about, why don't you each ask your question, then I'll take them as one. Is that all right? Go ahead. Yeah.
Good morning. I'm Jerome Johnson. I have a political question for you. You said that all the bills that the House have passed, it's ready to go to the Senate, but the Senate's not acting on it. You said that, hey, TPP, we wrote the bill, and the president just walked in and just walked away.
No, I said the United States.
The United States.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, for the bills that you have sitting waiting for the Senate to act on, you're not educating America on it, because the news media always say, oh, the Congress ain't doing nothing, they're not doing anything. You passed all these bills. She asked you about a bill, you said, yeah, I'll support it. Well, it's not going to go anywhere if the Senate doesn't act on it. So it dies. How do you see the Democratic Party educating the public, putting more pressure on the Senate to take action on all this work that you're doing that is just sitting there?
Great question, and I really do think the media is a big problem here. So I'll give you an example that happened to me. So a media team came in, 2 reporters from, it was HBO and Axios, and I guess it was going to be shown on HBO, right? And so they interviewed me for 30 minutes. They would distill down to, 1. And for 30 minutes, every question was about impeachment. This is months ago. This is 6 months ago, right? Long before current events. And they were pressing me because I had not come out in favor of impeachment. Why not? And don't you think? And and only after all that, the very last question, the female reporter says to me, well, aren't you Democrats worried that impeachment's just going to overpower everything and nobody will pay any attention to your agenda? I said, you've just spent 30 minutes interviewing me and you didn't ask a single question about gun control. You didn't ask one question about my position on Dreamers. You didn't ask a single question about how we're going to fix certain healthcare issues like drug pricing. I said, not one question. And then you dare to ask me to explain why the Democratic agenda, legislative agenda, is not getting attention? What am I supposed to do? Put a gun to your head to make you talk about what we're, because it's not like we're not doing it, but you're not giving it any attention because that's not the shiny object. And that is a problem. And it's incumbent on us to try to figure out that problem, as you say. And I think we have to do a better job of that. As one member of Congress, I try to, I use e-newsletters and other methods of communication to talk to people about what we're doing. Teresa introduced me, despite this conversation, my lane in Congress has been to champion federal employees and to try to modernize the federal government with respect to IT. A really sexy topic. Never was one. But the federal government spends over $100 billion a year in IT. $100 billion. We're the largest single driver, if you think about it, of IT in the world, of any customer. And yet, about 70 or 80% of that $100 billion is spent on legacy systems, just maintaining them. Well, we need to free that up and reinvest in ourselves, to come into the 21st century. There are real problems with legacy systems, including encryption, right? They're much more vulnerable, with one exception. The Chinese don't know how to hack into COBOL. So that's a good thing. But we've got some mainframes we're still using that are 40 years old. Some even older. And, we don't refresh PCs, in the government the way we do in the, when I worked for one of the companies I worked for, we probably replaced, and we had 42,000 employees at the time, we replaced computers for everybody about every 2 or 3 years. There are federal agencies where that is 7 or 8 years. In computer world, that's a lifetime. That's what can go wrong with that. Hard drives crash, archiving material is a problem, data can be breached, hacking is easier. I've spent a lot of time, and I've had a lot of success, as Teresa said, on a bipartisan basis. I've always had Republican support for this, and we've passed a number of bills. We're holding oversight hearings to make sure those bills get implemented. Who would know? In fact, even my own local newspaper, do you think the Washington Post has printed one word of that? And we actually got it done. We're not talking about it, we did it. And we are moving federal agencies into the 21st century. Go to the cloud, consolidate data centers, streamline your management to have a chief CIO, not a whole bunch of people running around. Manage your software, manage your intellectual property. We have a scorecard. We have hearings twice a year, and we score people in the 7 categories of the scorecard and then give them an overall grade to try to nudge them to improve and to give the CIO some tools to go to the boss saying, we don't want another D or F, we want an A, right, or a B. And it's actually working. And if we are successful, it will free up billions of dollars to reinvest in the enterprise, to make it more efficient, more secure, and serve the people better in terms of their mission. So I really agree with your challenge, and I get frustrated that engaging the press. I mean, if I go to this deposition this morning, it will be mobbed with press. And they're only going to ask me about one thing. They're not going to ask me about, well, now that we got you, what are your thoughts on drug pricing? Even though that's a pretty important and sexy topic. So the media is part of the problem. They're single-minded. They can only handle one thing at a time. And breaking through is a huge challenge for us. Sam?
My question is probably considered political, but I'm asking it from a humanitarian perspective. About a few weeks ago, I had a chance to meet a student at the Woodbridge campus in Nova. Bright young lady, doing well, honor graduate from one of our local high schools, taking one course that her family paid by credit card. She's undocumented, and her family's undocumented. She wants to get an education. She's charged out-of-state tuition. Is there anything happening that could help many young people in our community like this?
Not yet. If you remember, when the president revoked President Obama's executive order protecting Dreamers, Mr. Trump said, I feel that that order was illegal, and I will work with Congress. My heart goes out to these young people, and let's get a legislative fix. So there have been a number of proposals we've gone to him with, and in all cases, he's backed off. So he says something in the morning, but by the afternoon, Sam Miller or Mulvaney or somebody got to him and all of a sudden he's changed his mind. And this has been public, right? People have seen this in public. It was reported. And so trying to get, there is absolutely a legislative majority, and I think there are a number of Republicans as well as Democrats who want to fix this yesterday. These dreamers are innocent victims of the system or of decisions made by others. I'll give you an example. I brought a dreamer to 2 years ago to the State of the Union address as my guest. She is a high school scholar at Annandale High School. She mentors kids who are struggling in schools with academics as a tutor and volunteer. She's an athlete. She wants to, I think she wants to, be an entrepreneur when she gets out of school. She's looking forward to going to college. She did not know she was undocumented. Her parents had to tell her when she turned 16 to get her driver's permit. The only country she knows is this one. As far as she's concerned, she's an American. If you met her, you sure wouldn't know. I mean, unless you wore a sign saying I'm undocumented, you would assume she's a normal high school kid and a bright one, and one you'd love to spend a little time with and be proud of, by the way. Very articulate. And I just think we're making a terrible mistake as a country turning our backs on those people. I mean, these are fellow Americans. They don't have the right papers. We can regularize that. Why do we want to cause so much grief and stress on people who want to be Americans? And I've met with dozens of them, like you have. I mean, honestly, they're wonderful young people. We need them. They want to be proud Americans. They want to make their contribution. And it's just not in our self-interest to behave this way. And I can tell you, we sometimes use language and act like this is a new thing, these people undocumented. I can tell you that's not true. I know all kinds of people who came to America, without documentation. And some of them lived in the shadows and in shame all of their lives, afraid. Afraid to admit it or let even their family know. But we have a solution here that's humane and that will work and will allow folks to become productive citizens as they want to be. And they came to America as children, little babies in some cases. Are we going to treat them like criminals? What's wrong? No. That ought not to be our value system or our ethos. And I know there are people who feel differently, and we got to crack down and all that, and I understand that. I don't share that view. I really don't. I think there's a better way to approach this that makes America stronger, and makes our community stronger, and gives us the talent of the future we're going to need. And our history is replete with people who came here and made us stronger. I can take you to the Capitol of the United States. The first architect of the Capitol was an immigrant. The great painter inside the Capitol was an Italian immigrant. Carnegie was an immigrant. Marconi was an immigrant. Einstein was an immigrant. Did they make America better or weaker? Should we have deported them? You're teaching the future Einstein, maybe. You never know. But I do know that our country needs that talent to grow and prosper. And to fill, Teresa, I know your company, along with a lot of other tech companies, has a huge problem in getting the talent they need because we're not producing enough of that skilled workforce. A lot of those jobs can also be met, at least for a while, with rational immigration.
Thank you.
Thank you.